So imagine an audience member who doesn't know you, obviously, doesn't know your research or anything about this kind of research. And I think if we take that approach, it'll be pretty good. So, to start out, just introduce yourself and then maybe how you learned about Taylor or how you became associated with Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
like Grace Peven, and then you're studying for your PhD in hydrology, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and then tell us how you got to Taylor.
Yeah. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Grace Peven, and I'm a PhD student in the Water Resources program at University of Idaho in Moscow. I first learned about Taylor when I was looking for graduate programs, and I came across some water research being done by my advisor, Dr. Mary Engels, out at Taylor. And I was immediately interested because I had heard about Taylor before and that it was right in the middle of the Frank Church wilderness. And I thought that would be a really interesting place to do research because it's a natural laboratory and we can learn a lot about natural ecosystems, and watersheds out here. So based on like what I wanted to do with my career, I felt that it would be a really good match for me. So contacted my advisor, and she was studying springs out here, had just started inventorying and monitoring springs and getting them on the map, since a lot of them have not been mapped out here at all. So that was part of the project that I was joining in on.
And then now, can you, excuse me, so what is your project? If you could describe it.
Yeah. Basically, my research is detecting and understanding environmental change around spring ecosystems. And so, especially under the context of climate change and changing water conditions, we're seeing snowmelt happen earlier and earlier each year, with a lot of differences in timing and quantity on the landscape. And the watersheds around Taylor are all snowmelt dependent, and they feed downstream water sources throughout the whole Salmon River and Columbia Basin.
Oh, wait.
Project.
Yeah, tell us about your research project.
Cool. So basically my research is detecting and understanding change under the context of climate change in headwater spring ecosystems around Taylor Ranch. So basically the motivation for this project comes from observing climate change, especially in the western U.S. We're seeing earlier snowmelt timing and changes in quantity of snow throughout the winter, and also how quickly it melts off in the springtime. So our water resources are changing, and they're changing fairly rapidly. And a lot of our water that we rely on downstream starts at these springs up in the headwaters in the mountains. So they're really important water resources to study, and they've been pretty understudied in this part of the country. And they're really important here too, especially being in kind of a semi-arid climate. They're often like the only water resources for miles for wildlife and plants. So they provide a pretty important ecosystem. So they're important to monitor and study. And a lot of these springs out here have never been mapped. There's been a few researchers in the past that have started mapping these springs, but they haven't really been studied long term and over time. So what I'm doing is measuring discharge and flow at these springs to understand how they're changing in the dry season, in the summer season. So from May to October, I'll come out here and measure discharge and soil moisture and water quality measurements as an indicator of change, and to understand how the springs are reacting to changes in snowmelt timing and precipitation. So after I collect my field measurements, I'll use remote sensing to correlate the satellite imagery with the field measurements I've been taking this summer. And using the satellite imagery, it's a really powerful tool to look back in time, to understand, to start building a data set over time that tells us how these springs have been changing.
I like to include some awkward silence at the end in order to, as a buffer for cutting.
Okay. Yeah.
So if
Cool.
I weird you out, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, let me know if you want me to like explain any aspect more, or if that made sense.
Can you talk about the process of locating springs? I know that you rely on some remote sensing data, but that's not the entire picture, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of these springs were previously mapped by a couple previous grad students, but there's a lot of springs that are still unmapped on the landscape, and I found the more time I spend out here, the more intuitive the location of springs are. So, and it changes throughout the year. I found that in April and May, the springs were fairly obvious on the landscape because they stuck out. Their coloration of the riparian vegetation around the spring footprint was pretty unique. So as I'm spending a lot of time out here and hiking around, it's more obvious where the springs are based on that vegetation. And they really look like islands, terrestrial islands on the landscape a lot of the time. Sometimes they'll start at the headwaters of a stream and then continue down, and you can see that classic riparian corridor. But other times they kind of look like terrestrial islands on the landscape. They'll be this kind of random patch of green that sticks out, especially in this landscape where we've experienced so many fires, and it's pretty burnt up and exposed. The springs stick out like a sore thumb in this watershed in particular.
Do you ever feel excitement when you're spring hunting?
Yeah, it's really exciting. Most likely, I'm not the first person that's ever been to some of these springs, but it can feel that way, especially out hiking by myself a lot of the time. And if I spot a spring from a distance and then make it my mission to get up to that spring, and sometimes it isn't a spring, and that's okay. And sometimes it is a spring, and that's really exciting to get it on the map and, you know, measure the water and look at the vegetation and kind of get to know this new little island ecosystem. It's definitely exciting.
Why are you drawn specifically to the area around Taylor Ranch? Having gone on one of these hikes with you, it's pretty arduous. There was a lot of elevation game. It's not easy field work. What motivates you to get out of bed and do these hikes in order to collect your data?
I think I'm drawn to this landscape because of how rugged and inaccessible it feels. I think in these places that are not easy for humans to navigate and hike around, I think you can find some of the most wild pockets, whether that be like a cool old growth stand or wildlife or a game trail, or a shed on the trail. I think you can find a lot, and that kind of removes you from everyday conveniences and what we've grown used to in our like very built environment. So it feels like kind of an antithesis to that, and I think that draws me to this landscape. And I mean, it's very rugged and kind of unkempt, and fire and other disturbances are allowed to just run their course and do what they're supposed to do. And it's really special to have these places conserved and protected still. And we can learn a lot about ecology and ecosystems and water in these places that are just left to do what they're supposed to do.
Nice, that was good.
Cool.
My feet are dying.
Yeah, you're right in the sun. I feel like maybe it's important to mention that they're not unaffected by our activities, though.
Yeah, you should. Let's see, how could we frame that?
I think tagged on to what I just said, but yeah, I don't know how you would like mesh that in. Just tagged on to what I just said about like this being a natural conserved area. It's still affected by human activities because all of our water, the water cycle in particular is, are you recording?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. The water, the water cycle in particular is, connects everything. So just because this landscape is removed from cities and towns and our built infrastructure and environment, it doesn't mean that it's not affected by what we do. It can feel like when you're in the middle of the mountains here that, this is an untouched landscape and it hasn't been touched by modern day industry and pollution that we see in other places. But there's, global, regional cycles and processes that connect everywhere, especially the water cycle. What we emit into the atmosphere gets carried through our clouds and our water and then gets deposited in other places, in like really wild places like the Frank Church around Taylor. So that's part of, studying springs. That's part of studying springs, is that they're affected by, the water is sourced from snowmelt or precipitation at some point. It's probably not sourced from the previous year. It takes a long time for that precipitation and snowmelt to reach the spring on its surface. But it carries with it whatever at that time was present in the atmosphere. And so we do see those impacts even in a place like this.
Are you ever concerned about your own personal impact on these very tiny little ecosystems?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think about that. I like to have the mindset that I'm a visitor in these places. Sometimes I do feel bad when I visit springs and I spook up a deer, or I can see lots of bear, scat, and animal sign. I feel like I'm walking into someone's home without being invited. And I think that's unfortunately what science can be sometimes. To like better understand something, you do have to have some kind of impact, but you can minimize that impact as much as possible. So when I get to a spring, I try not to step right in the water. I try not to crush plants. I try to be very mindful of where I'm stepping. But the measurements I'm taking are really low impact, capturing water, measuring discharge, and then releasing that water flowing back downstream. So I don't feel like I'm taking a lot from the environment. I like to think that I am respecting it more by trying to understand it better and like trying to give it a voice.
Like a deer, though, you also come to the spring for water. Can you talk about that commonality between you and the wild animals that use the springs? In particular, the game trails, which are so important to your work in a way.
Yeah, I feel like I rely on the mule deer out here a lot for the trails that they make. And 9 times out of 10, there's a really nice game trail leading to a spring, which also tells you how important these places are on the landscape. They act as refugia for wildlife in really dry times of the year. But yeah, I think we can't separate humans from the natural world. Like humans have always been here since time immemorial and have used these springs. And maybe they're not used to the same extent that they used to be used, but I'm out hiking around here and I need to get to the spring to refill my water bottle. So I also rely on them to do this work and to feed myself.
You've had a number of hitches now at Taylor, right? Can you talk about what has stayed with you when you're away from Taylor? Like what have you learned or encountered here that stays with you when you get back home?
That's a good question. What has stayed with me?
Or I'll put it another way. Taylor is a place of comings and goings, with the exception of the caretaker. Researchers conduct research and then they leave. They come back and then maybe they leave permanently. And I'm wondering what sticks with people, or you in particular, once you've left the place.
Well, I think obviously the contrast between how wild this place is versus, going back to Moscow or a city or a town. The extent of this area and how large of an area is conserved and protected here is kind of unfathomable when you are just driving on a road, driving on a highway, hopping from town to town, and you're constantly surrounded by the built environment. And I think it could be startling to come out here and see that, exact opposite phenomenon. I think for me, because I come back about once a month, and that's been really interesting to come back and forth and just see. It gives me a unique perspective for how things change over time, because I think when you live and stay in a place over time, those changes between seasons are really subtle. But to come back once a month, those changes are really apparent. And the whole hillside is green, and then the next month it's dried out a lot, or it's smoky in July now. Or coming back to these springs too, a lot of the times, I'm measuring quantitative data, but a lot of the time what strikes me is the kind of qualitative feeling that I get when I come back to these springs and see how they've changed over time. That is hard to really quantify and put a number to, but you can just tell, like, it smells different here. There's different flowers or shrubs flowering right now that weren't here a month ago, or it feels like a little hotter at the spring or a little cooler at the spring. So I think that's what's really valuable about coming in and out of Taylor is that outside perspective of change.
When I was talking to the wildlife biologist Morris Hornacher, he said that feel is a very important thing when conducting science, because we can often get overly dependent on satellite imagery or other forms of remote sensing, but it's important to have a sense of what it's like in order to understand change, especially subtle environmental change and cues.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk maybe a little bit more about how feel and one's own kind of personal relationship to the research object can actually be scientific?
Yeah, I think remote sensing and other tools are really powerful tools to study the environment, but I don't think anything replaces being out in the fields and exploring without necessarily collecting quantitative data, which you can do in the field, but just getting a sense of, like, how these ecosystems or environments, forests, whatever you're studying, how they feel, how they smell, what are the sounds. It gives you, it inspires you to study and understand these systems even more, being physically in the place, because you build this connection and relationship with that place, especially when you come back multiple times and start really getting to know these places intimately. I don't think that technology can really replace that. I think it's really important as scientists to be out in the field and on the ground, seeing with all of your senses, what you can observe from these places.
That's good. Hold on a second. My feet are dying.
Yeah, no worries.
Or maybe I'll just do it like this. But just when you answer, just talk to the camera.
Oh, okay. Am I looking at you too much?
No. That's why I'm always.
Oh, not. Oh, gotcha. So not like looking down at the ground.
So
yeah.
But that's,
okay.
That's why I don't want to do that, and I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to.
No, it's okay. I can.
No. It's too awkward.
It's definitely more comfortable, like, speaking to a person.
It distracts me. Yeah. Let's see. This is a hard question. What is a spring?
What is a spring? A spring is the surface expression of groundwater. So it's where surface water and groundwater interact and interface. And that's like the most simple definition, is that it's the surface expression of groundwater. More technically, it's where the aquifer meets the surface, and that's often controlled by geology. That can be through fault lines or contacts, which is where bedrock comes up and meets the surface. And it's often an impermeable rock layer that's the base of an aquifer, and through whatever geologic processes make it this way, that impermeable rock layer is pushed up to the surface, and it carries with it groundwater. But a spring is also an ecosystem. So it's sourced by this groundwater, but when it gets to the surface, it often creates its own insular ecosystem, that you'll find riparian vegetation, sometimes rare plants. You'll find a lot of biodiversity. So often they're these biological hotspots on the environment that support unique wildlife and plants on the landscape.
Is it? We can see surface watersheds, right? Mountains, for the most part, are carved by water. Does it become harder to understand and to quantify a subsurface body of water? Like, sorry, I screwed that up. I'm also getting nailed by something. I think I got stung.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's fine. Oh.
Is it in your shirt?
No, it's just like, it just happened real quick as I was talking. I was like, let's see. I just don't know enough about hydrology. I really just want you to talk about how streams are these fucked up, mysterious entities.
Springs are?
Springs, I mean.
Yeah.
Why is it difficult to understand the subsurface life of water and spring?
It's hard to study something that you can't see. There's lots of ways that we can measure the surface of the earth because we can use all of our senses and tools to measure the surface. But when it comes to groundwater and the subsurface environment, there are certainly tools and technology that exist to study it. It's just harder, and you have to use proxies a lot of the time to really get to the core of what you want to understand. So, and oftentimes the groundwater flow paths and aquifers are not really well understood. Like we know where aquifers exist a lot of the time, but we don't necessarily have them mapped to their full extent or understand how they're recharged exactly. What's interesting about groundwater is that, well, when we think about a watershed, it's basically land that drains any water that falls onto it. It drains it to a central point. And groundwater is really different because it can be recharged outside of the drainage boundary, outside of a watershed. So this spring here, it's in Pioneer Watershed, but it could be recharged by the watershed over, because the geology could be that the flow paths are going underneath the mountain and bringing water here. It could be that, these different geologic flow paths are coalescing at this one spot, but they're bringing water from multiple points, multiple drainages. And I think that's confusing to wrap our heads around because we can see snow on top of a mountain and we can, over time, watch it melt and we can see our streams get bigger and bigger. And so there's an obvious connection there. But with springs, they're not always fluctuating. So some of these springs are really stable because the water that we're seeing surface today could be 50 years old, could be 100 years old. And when I say 50 to 100 years old, it's that the precipitation, the snowmelt or the rainfall that we get, it could take 100 years to work its way through the geologic flow paths to surface as a spring. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
No, you did.
basically there's a lot that we don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of mystery to groundwater, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Like. Do you think you're attracted to that mystery?
Yeah. I think it's exciting that there's a lot to still understand about springs, and part of it is that they're often in really rugged, remote locations that are hard to access, and that's a big reason that springs out here have not been studied because they're just incredibly hard to get to. And then when you get to a spring, they're not confined in like a neat little channel that you can study. They're often like seeping out from multiple locations, and it can be confusing. I need a second to think about that.
Yeah.
Like this kind of work as in like in general environmental science or natural resources or
No,
hydrology.
this is very demanding field work, and I'm wondering what advice you would give to students wanting to pursue similar kinds of work.
Mhm.
Remote, rugged,
Mhm.
difficult.
I think going in with the expectation that it won't be a walk in the park is important. Um, there's going to be pokey plants, and you're probably going to fall down on the trail, and that's okay. Um, but I think it's things that are really challenging, both physically and intellectually, are often the most rewarding. Um, and so I think about that when I'm doing this work. I think that it's challenging to get here, but the rewards are high because there's a reason these places haven't been studied very much, because it's really hard. And I think we've we've discovered so much in science, and I think often we feel that like there's nothing left to learn or discover, and I definitely felt that way when I was younger. But the more and more I learn about these places, the more that I find we don't understand, and what's left to there's a lot left to understand and study about these places. And I think it takes creativity, and curiosity and patience to again be out in these places physically and to observe and take your time. Like an interesting research question isn't just going to like pop into your head. It takes patience and time to be in these places and just listen to them. Um, when I started this research, to come to my current research, I did a lot of reading from other scientists that have studied springs and hydrology. And I thought I knew, okay, here's the question I want to do. And then when I got out here, I had to shift around my question for what I was observing here and what was possible to do also. And I think that's really important, to just be open-minded and curious and be open to being surprised by what you find out here.
Yeah, it sounds like your research question evolved out of a kind of immersion in the physical environment, as
Mhm.
opposed to just coming up with it ready-made after reading a bunch of articles.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's part of the scientific method and process, is that it starts with an observation and then it leads to a hypothesis or a question. Um, and I think that's really true. I think it has to start with some observation. Um, and I think in this type of work in water resources, in natural resources, that has to start with just hiking around and getting out into the environment and looking at something and being like, huh, that's kind of weird, or that's interesting. I wonder why that hill looks like that, or I wonder why those trees are there, or why are these springs showing up in this one spot. And just asking also really basic questions like that, and that'll lead you, I think, down a rabbit hole of other questions. So starting with like, and I think it can be overwhelming too. Like you look around here and you think like this landscape is so vast and there's so much to cover and so much to be curious about. But just starting with those really basic questions and being like, I wonder why the groundwater is coming up here. I wonder why this is the way it is. And starting there will lead you to an interesting place.
Or maybe just, I feel like hiking over there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, not always having a specific goal or direction too can feel nice, and just meandering around the woods.
Battery's gonna die.
Okay.
Have you had any memorable encounters with wildlife while working with springs?
I actually haven't. And I think I purposely try to prevent, running into a bear or spooking up wildlife. So, when I approach a spring, I'm very intentional about it, very cautious to not, spook a bear for my own safety, but also not to stress out the bear because it's probably enjoying a really nice, cool, shady spot at a spring, and I'm just coming up and ruining its day. So I try to be intentional about, when I'm walking up and making noise and just approaching it quietly and not stomping into the spring.
Like me. I always burst out laughing knowing that like the first thing I did was just like get to the middle of the spring and suck up all the water.
It's okay. It's life-giving. You need it.
Thank you, Spring Mother.
Yes. Blessings. Don't include that.
Grace, do you know where your love of water began?
Yeah. My parents were rafting guides in their younger days, and they kind of kept that tradition when I was growing up of going rafting every summer. So I started rafting from a young age with my family on the Salmon River and rivers in Washington and Oregon. And I just loved it. I loved being on the water and the perspective that you get of the landscape when you're floating down a river and like letting the river take you where it wants to take you and kind of working with it. I loved that aspect of rafting. And we'd also, when we'd get to camp, there'd usually be a tributary coming in at the campsite, and I would love to just hike up the tributary right in the middle of the creek for hours just to see where it went, and it just felt like a different world in there, in the water. And yeah, I've just always wanted to be around water and studying it and playing in it. Yeah.
I'm looking for the source.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about this watershed?
About Pioneer, specifically? Yeah, just in general?
Yeah, where does, like, you could talk about, like, you could describe the dendrite, Pioneer to Big Creek to the Middle Fork to the Salmon to the Columbia.
Yeah. So Pioneer, which is the watershed right behind Taylor Ranch, is it's a really small catchment. It's about 6 square miles, and it drains, the highest point that it drains from is Dave Lewis Peak at about 9,200 feet. So it's a really steep drainage because Taylor, where the base of Pioneer, where it comes into Big Creek, is about 3,800 feet. So it's draining a lot of elevation from the top to the bottom, and it's really steep and rugged, rocky. The Diamond fire in 2000 burned pretty hot in this watershed, so you can see down logs everywhere you go, and there's little timber patches and forest patches left, but mostly it burned at pretty high severity. But it's interesting because there's so many downed trees and standing dead trees that you think about how shady and forested this watershed used to be. And now it's hot and dry and exposed and kind of unforgiving in that way. And I think a lot about when I'm up here that I'll never see what this watershed used to look like just over 20 years ago before the fire. It was a completely different place, and in one fire it changed its character completely. But for that reason, these springs are easier to find in that way because they're more part of this more exposed matrix now. Like they would have been tough to spot with thick forests and dense forests, how it used to be in Pioneer. But yeah, Pioneer flows into Big Creek, and Taylor's about 6 or 7 miles up from the confluence of the Middle Fork. So Big Creek then flows into the Middle Fork of the Salmon River and goes through. It kind of marks the entrance to the Impassable Canyon on the Middle Fork, where the trail stops and really sheer cliffs come up. It's one of the deepest canyons in North America. And then the Middle Fork flows into the main Salmon River, and then eventually the lower Salmon River and the Snake River, and into the Columbia, and then into the ocean. So we're just in this tiny part of this huge basin, huge watershed. But it's all connected. It's where, like, these springs are where our water begins for so much of Idaho and Washington State, and the whole Columbia River Basin.
Do you think the changed environmental conditions post-fire have affected the flow of springs?
That's a good question. I know that there's been research done on how fire has affected creeks and streams, but not necessarily springs that I know of. But it's definitely fire. From what I've observed, fire usually burns hotter around springs because there's more vegetation growth around springs. But then it recovers more quickly because it has that consistent source of water. So vegetation recovers more quickly. It's more resilient to fire because of that water source, and higher water content in the vegetation too. But it's, fire can sometimes change the plant community within a watershed. So it's possible that maybe we're seeing different vegetation structure and dynamics post-fire, but yeah, that's hard to say. I don't know exactly how much these springs have changed. I know I've noticed in some of the springs at lower elevation that I've been studying, I've noticed that within the spring footprint there's standing dead conifers, and that's really interesting to me because they're Doug firs, and that's not a hospitable environment for Doug firs within basically a wetland, a spring footprint. That's not where you typically see them grow. So that makes me think that something after the fire changed the flow path of the springs, or maybe those springs used to be in a different location. Like there was something happening there that that I don't think that water used to be there, because the Doug firs wouldn't have been able to survive.